मेकर कथा कराने. Can I talk to this? No, I talk on that. Don't understand. I can talk. Hello. Hello. I did that here once and I was not very, it wasn't very dignified. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this last session of the first Friday of the BCIS Festival of Ideas. Really glad that you could make it to this session and hope some of you had a chance to be in the previous sessions as well. This session is really interesting because it's, we have to thank actually Professor Uyangoda for the title, I think, because he suggested we have a session on democracy on the streets, and that's exactly what we are having. It's we're calling this session Democracy on the Streets, Anatomies of Protests in South Asia and Elsewhere. And before I introduce the facilitator and the panel, or facilitator of this session, Dr. Sasanka Pereira, I just want to say that this BCIS, this is a part of our celebrations of our 50th anniversary. BCIS has been around for 50 years. And this is a way of us trying to garner the ideas of people outside our own immediate circle, to try to get some new ideas on board and try to think about how we can look at all of the work we do on international relations with new perspective. So we're very grateful to all our 22 collaborators who have decided to participate in this festival with us. And if you scan your QR code, these are things that are a little bit beyond me, but if you scan your QR code, or if you're like me, you pick up a hard copy brochure from Amali, who's here, you will see that we have every Friday of November, except for the 15th, which is a Poya Day, except for the 15th, we have events that are taking place here and in the Colombo Kamata, which is a space towards the back of BCIS, and where we are having 2 plays and a session, a formal roundtable on called the Gamni Korea retrospective. Also want to add that in this hall, in the next, on the 8th, around the 8th and the 22nd and the 29th, we will have 3 exhibitions. So if you and your friends and would like to come, not only on a Friday, but on Thursday and Saturday as well, you can come and see those exhibitions. But all those are in your program, and please have a look at them and join us in both the celebration and in generating all these new ideas and new discussions about the issues that our partners are actually showcasing. So what we did actually was call for people who wanted to participate with us in this festival, and we are very grateful to 22 of them who have joined us. So that's a little bit of an introduction to what the festival is. We didn't have a formal opening, so this is in place of that. So now I will call on Dr. Sasanka Pereira, who is a prominent sociologist and retired as a professor at the South Asia University in New Delhi, where he also served as Dean of Social Sciences and Vice President. Sasanka's research focuses on contemporary social theory, particularly the politics of culture, urban space, education, art, and visual culture in South Asia. He also explores the methodological implications of photography and the politics of nationalism and ethnicity. Dr. Pereira has published extensively, with some of his works translated into Tamil, Japanese, and Spanish. He is the founding editor of the biannual journal Society and Culture in South Asia, co-published published by Sage and SAU. Additionally, he's a poet, photographer, and blogger. His collection of poems and photographs from three countries, was published in 2013. I apologize. As the principal investigator for the project Heritage's Placemaking, he heads the theoretical strand of decolonization and is conducting research on Buddhist pilgrimage trails in significant locations such as Ayodhya, Lumbini, Varanasi, and Bodh Gaya. So thank you, Sasanka, for agreeing to kind of facilitate this conversation. I think you're one of the best people to do that. So I will actually hand over the mic to you now. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Priyank. Yeah, I don't know where you got all that information. I thought some of them were not supposed to be publicly available. So I will go there if you don't mind. I mean, and I took permission from Melanie. I mean, I'm very bad sitting down. So I'll just go there, I'll come back, right? This work? Oh, wonderful. What I will do is, see, the title is not here, but it's Democracy on the Streets, the Anatomies of Protest in South Asia and Elsewhere. And I am a regular sociologist. I'm no expert on protest. I mean, I have taken part in a few of those in my time. And the first one landed me in the Katugastota jail because of ragging in the University of Peradeniya, which at that time was in Polgol. So I do know something about that. But compared to experts like Melanie, and I told her I did my homework on her as a good sociologist, and even my partner and my sister, lots of friends and so on who took part very seriously in the Sri Lankan protests of 2022. I'm not an expert, and also Kaushalya here, right? So these are the, important people who know about protest. So why I'm trying to say is that we do have to talk about protest in the street, but I am coming into this as a kind of a non-expert in certain ways. So to talk about these things today, we have Melanie Gunatilaka from Sri Lanka, Irene Khan from Bangladesh, David Oteano from Kenya, and obviously there's me. I will not do much except to moderate this. The theme of today's conversation brought to my mind the title of a very old book published in 1970. It was called Why Men Rebel by Ted Robert Gurr. Everybody knows this book, which I had bought from a street corner bookseller somewhere in California in the 1980s. Despite the title, Men, he was not only talking about men, obviously, but he was talking about why people rebel against prevailing systems and status quos. Or in terms of today's conversation, we can rephrase this question as, why do people come to the street, right? And also to protest. I want to share some thoughts and information on this theme to create some kind of a broader context for our conversation that will continue after this. Then in this broader context, I think it will make more sense for us to discuss why people come to the streets to protest and what does it say about democracy in each of the places we come from. Now we have Sri Lanka, we have Kenya, and we have Bangladesh. Now, these are all supposed to be democratic states. Now, if democracy works, why do people have to come to the streets? So this is one of the questions that we should keep on asking. According to what is known as the Global Protest Tracker, since about 2017, over 700 significant anti-government protests have erupted worldwide. Now, when these kinds of entities say significant, you have to be, somewhat suspicious because, 10 people protesting can also be significant, depending on how it happened, where it happened, and sometimes the outcome, right? But I just want to throw out some figures to get a sense of what this protest kind of dynamic looks like globally. But protests are not only anti-government, as we know from experience. So when I was an undergraduate in University of Colombo and then later in California, we did have protests in universities, and sometimes they were known nationally, and at other times nobody knew about it, but it was important to us, right? To achieve certain kinds of things that were locally important or institutionally important. More than 147 countries have experienced significant protests since 2017. About 18% of these protests have lasted more than 3 months. So these are the serious things that have gone on and on for a while, including ours, 2022. In addition, 258 significant anti-government protests specifically motivated by economic conditions have occurred since 2017. Even though I'm not an ardent believer of numbers, particularly when we do not know their sources or methods of compilation, in general, these numbers show interesting trends. And as a sociologist, I am interested in trends and patterns. People do not just protest because they have nothing better to do, right? Protests are risky even in the best of conditions. Now, when I was a graduate student in the University of California, people used to tell me, you are a very comfortable place, no protests and so on and so forth. And by and large, that was kind of correct. I mean, they were protesting for very different things in my time. And sometimes for political issues, but mostly for the food quality in the canteen and so on and so forth. But you will see, and America was supposed to be a safe place to protest. And these are the guys who are now teaching us what democracy means, right? And that election result in a few weeks can be a very funny result, whichever way it goes. But what I'm trying to say is this. Even in a place like that, which is supposed to be a safe place to protest, as opposed to our kind of place, the way in which the protests in universities, including the Ivy League places, against what was going on in the Gaza and that area were handled was not that different from the way our people handled the 2022 protests at different times with this expired gas cylinders and so on and so forth. So I'm saying this because when we come to these kinds of things, these notions of safety and more enhanced democracy in the places where we protest is suspicious. It no longer is something that you can take very seriously. So, as I was saying, people do not protest because they have nothing better to do. So, what does it mean to each of us, whether we are in Sri Lanka or whether we are in Bangladesh or Kenya or some other place, as individuals and to our countries as well as the world, when this many people across the world protest in the streets? What is going on? We're supposed to be democracies. American State Department and the ambassador here and so on and so forth tells us it's the best democracy in the world. And why are those people in the street, right? India is supposed to be the world's largest, not the best, largest democracy. They are also in the street quite often, right? Why? What does it say about the nature of democracy in each of these places if this is happening? What does it say about those who rule in these places? What does it say about the nature of public space? What does it say about the structures and methods of governance in these countries? Now, to me, talking about protests in the street doesn't make any sense unless we also ask these kinds of questions, right? And depending on how these protests emerged, how long they lasted, how they were handled, and the final outcome, What can we say about protests as methods of social change? Now, this is very crucial. Because protests, those figures I gave you, a lot of them didn't achieve anything, didn't achieve tangible, lasting results. Some of them did. And we can ask ourselves, what did the 2022 protests achieve? Right? I mean, a lot of people don't give it much credit, but it did achieve quite a lot. We had a funny president because of the protests, who was lucky enough to be appointed. We had one who fled. We had an entire government that changed, and not that it was replaced by anything legitimate, but all those things happened. And I would say the election result, the last election result of the presidential election, also had a lot to do with that protest, right? Which again is not taken into account, including by the winners, right? So these are the kinds of questions, Melanie, that we need to take into account when we are looking. So it's protest is not just something in the street, right? What does it do? Now, Sri Lanka's 2022 protest lasted for about 8 months, within which we saw massive public support and participation across regions and cutting across class and ethno-religious boundaries in varying degrees. And I have not seen or heard or read about a protest of that kind before. You know, someone like my mother, who was a very non-protesting kind of person, for the first time in her life, after maybe marginal things in University of Peradeniya, protested when the Indian peacekeeping force came to Sri Lanka in front of the Indian High Commission. She wrote to me, I was not in the country. Said, today I protested. But that is just a handful of people. But this was very different because of the cross-cutting nature of that protest, right? So we also have to ask now, how did that happen? Why? So it did cut across ethno-religious boundaries in varying degrees and class and region and so on. And it had significant political consequences, some of which I flagged a little while ago. After all, the government fell. A president resigned and fled. But not all changes were positive, as we know by experience. But significantly, it was by and large a very peaceful protest on the part of the protesters. This does not say the same about elements of the government of the time which tried to use violence to intimidate protesters. That is also something we know now as facts. So my sense is that Melanie will have much more to say about these protests, what happened, and what the future might hold. Bangladesh's 2024 protests that ousted the former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina had massive public support too. Though it culminated in 2024, elements of these protests had been going on since about 2022, mostly led by students. It also turned violent, largely due to the way the uprising was handled by the state. So in that sense, it was very different from what was happening in Sri Lanka. But they have also very interesting, visually interesting connotations to the similarities between the Sri Lankan protests and the Bangladeshi one. There were very striking similarities with what people actually did. And they posed for these pictures, and some of my students, until recently I was teaching from a multinational classroom. So these Bangladeshi students were telling me, hey, we have done what you did. We also jumped into Sheikh Hasina's pool and so on and so forth, right? And these pictures were circulating. In the last week or so, just a few days ago, new protests have emerged demanding the resignation of the caretaker government's president as well. So in Bangladesh's case, this is ongoing. It has not ended. As far as protests in Bangladesh go, the 2013 Shahbag protests is also a significant event in terms of its political consequences and public participation. Perhaps, I guess, Irene can add more to these protests in terms of both information and nuance coming directly from her location. Kenya has had at least 8 significant protests from 2017 to 2014, 2024. That is what has been reported globally and what these tracking organizations consider important, right? I said no at the beginning that one has to be suspicious of figures and who compiles them. I am sure much more has happened in the country that we don't know about. There was the finance bill protest in June 2024, which lasted for 2 months or so. 2017 election protests also lasted for 2 months. End femicide now protest in January 2024 also lasted for 3 months. All these were in varying sizes in terms of public participation, right? So it was, these were not massive compared to 2022 Sri Lankan one, the ones in Kenya. But let me be clear about one thing. Just because we are focusing on 3 countries today, that is Bangladesh, Kenya, and Sri Lanka, protests are a global phenomenon. It's not just about us. They are not limited to countries experiencing economic difficulties alone, as is the wrong but popular perception, right? Protests also happen in countries that are supposed to be affluent and where political systems are supposed to be more stable and more democratic than ours. This is what I was trying to establish at first. As the organizers' concept note suggests, democracy and people on the streets are 2 sides of a coin, mutually reinforcing and interdependent. But why is this the case? Why are protests happening in some places more often and with violent consequences than in others? Why do protests occur at all? What does this say about the nature of democracy? And what do the ways in which protests are handled say about the human value regimes give to their own people? This is a serious question we had to ask in the context of Bangladesh, which had very serious consequences. And how do I know? In my case, I know about these things not by looking at news, because I was talking to my students, right? So what do the emergence of protests say about the leaders who have been often elected by the people themselves to govern them and then want them removed? As we proceed with this conversation, I would invite all the speakers to reflect on the following questions posed by the organizers from their own locations and based on their own experiences. So to me, the way to understand these things with a sense of nuance is not to theorize this at the moment, right? But to bring your experience. One, what is it that has triggered mass protests in these places? And what political desires and expectations led to these? 2, what contributions have protests made to launch new agendas for social, economic, and political transformation? 3, why do protesting citizens reclaim sovereignty? And what are its signals for reimagining democracy? Why, when you say reclaiming sovereignty, then there is a very clear assumption it is lost. So how was it lost? Has the idea of democracy in your country acquired a new life after the protests? If yes, how? If not, why? Now, beyond these 4 questions from BCIS, I would like to add a few more to these questions that I've already kind of discussed that you can reflect on while you speak. 1, however legitimate the reasons for a protest might be, what happens when there is no clear plan or agenda to proceed beyond the protest, particularly if it manages to pressurize a regime, like what happened in our case? Are felt needs, felt experiences, and political rhetoric enough to forge tangible futures? So that is a fairly serious, not a very pleasant question to ask. 2, what would a protest need beyond the protest itself to make it a mass movement? There is a fundamental difference between a protest and it becoming a mass movement. I think in our case, that kind of did happen, even though this has not been written about carefully yet. And how many protests you know of have become a movement in some way? These are the kinds of questions we can ask. With this, we can now proceed, but I want to introduce our three speakers. Melanie Gunathilaka is a climate and political activist from Sri Lanka. See, sounds very important. And you didn't say this, they wrote to me, right? She is a co-founder of Climate Action Now Sri Lanka. She advocates for debt justice, climate justice, and the protection of fundamental freedoms. She works as a researcher at the Law and Society Trust. She is also a member of Yukti Collective, the Institute for Political Economy Sri Lanka, and Debt for Climate Global Movement. So that is Melanie. And Irene Khan is a visual artist, journalist, and research analyst based in Dhaka, Bangladesh. Her research focuses on non-traditional security issues concerning Bangladesh and South Asia region, vis-a-vis climate change, religious extremism, migration and refugee problems, gender-based violence, and child abuse. Irene uses both traditional research methods and creative methods for academic research. She works on complex issues with various marginalized communities using community art. Irene's artwork portrays visions of spiritual awakenings through mystical states, exploring life and asking questions. David Otiano is a peasant agroecologist, a smallholder food producer, and member of the Kenyan Peasant League, where he serves as the general coordinator and policy advisor. So this organization is a social movement of smallholder farmers and consumers with a vision of transitioning to peasant agroecology for food sovereignty and climate change, climate justice. So you will see that these three colleagues have a lot in common. They also have significant differences. So my suggestion to begin with, Melanie, is take 20 minutes or so and to begin the conversation. And obviously we'll come back to you and everybody else. So you want to be there or come here? Melanie, you are comfortable being there? Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mr. Sankar, for the introduction and for the brief outlook on the protest that's happening worldwide right now. Just to stay within the parameters of the topics that were discussed or the questions that were posed by the organizers, I'd start talking about what democracy meant to me when I first started going for protests and how I started looking at democracy afterwards. So the very first protest that I took part in 2022 was a protest that we organized near Green Path, which ended up at Independence Square, where we continued to protest for about a week before we started going to Goldface on April 9th. So this Independence Square, which is usually a very protected space, where there had been other conflicts of like people sitting on the ground, people are not allowed to do certain things, was actually felt very free that day. You know, the young children or the youth were climbing onto things which you are not allowed to do usually, and were holding placards, shouting, doing all sorts of things. And we had very little resistance from the security guards or the law enforcement officers that day. So this was 4th of April in 2022. And after we started protesting in the at the Goldface, my next experience with democracy is, I'd like to highlight, is as 9th of May. This was the day that government supporters or the more to say thugs, the people who were holding sticks and weapons came to attack Golface. And I specifically like to focus on how media portrayed that day and the media's attention. For almost all of the media, it was a crisis to the whole country. It was a national problem, and everybody reported it. And everybody reported how this nonviolent protest site where people were democratically asking for their rights were attacked, and how the law enforcement officers allowed that to happen, and how general public who were not at the protest site resisted, and how they came forward to protect the protesters. And the third experience I'd like to highlight is the 22nd of July, 2022. So this is the day soon after Ranil Wickremesinghe became the president of the country, elected by the parliament. He ordered an attack on the protest site in the night. And I was outside at the time, but I was trying to go there and met with violence by the military officers. I won't go into detail on that day, but the next day morning, when we first heard that the gates were open to the protest site, we were going there. And I remember hearing radio while we were stuck in traffic, hearing radio going on a lottery box or somewhere. And for that radio announcer, it was just another beautiful morning. And the birds are chirping, everything is fine, and we are ready for a beautiful day ahead. So this contrast between how media responded to 9th of May, when the protest site got attacked by thugs or by the government protesters, and how their response changed when it was the law enforcement officers, when it was an order by the president, was entirely different. And I think that's when I understood that the role media plays in terms of making sure what is important to people and what is not, what becomes a national issue and what doesn't. So I'd like to think that my understanding of democracy has now massively changed over the last 2 years. I now see democracy as a space allowed by the government, or space allowed by the authority for people to show dissent, because we are taught that we have freedom to peaceful dissent. We have the right to peaceful assembly. We have the right to voice our opinions. But just because we have the right doesn't always mean that people have the chance to do so. So with that, I hope I didn't take too much time there, but I'll quickly go to the question about why people protest. I think to draw a few examples from the protest happened in Sri Lanka. One, people protested as resistance, especially the working class people, starting from the farmers' protest in Valsapugala, who were protesting against the human-wildlife conflict, asking for lands to be allocated for animals, to teachers' protest, to the student protest, and the government servants, the railway employees. So all of those protests, I think, had some form of resistance to certain actions or inactions by the government. But with the protests becoming more of a mass movement in Colombo, and we saw how youth were getting involved, I think there was also an element of making a statement, especially by the youth, in a way of saying that we are not ready to take your oppression anymore. We are not ready to sit by idly and watch what you do anymore. And this also translated into a lot of creativity on social media and also on ground at the protest site itself. And this went to sort of crushing these massive images boosted by media during election campaigns to make them nothing, to completely ridicule them and make them into a joke. If especially saw the memes made regarding the then President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, and the jokes and the posters, the stand-up comedy shows that was presented at Gotagogama, at the protest site. So all of those things, I think, had this element of a statement, especially by the youth and also by the artists and the creatives. And in terms of understanding how these movements lasted or what they transcended into, we also see this lot of push or lot of interest in getting youth involved in politics now. Right? Almost all the political parties, the existing political parties, now want to have youth in their teams. And it's not only limited to the political parties. We also see this in different organizations, like even like United Nations. They want to hear what the youth has to say, and they want to give more space for women, things like that. So after the protest movement ended, it was very difficult to contain it, because the whole movement in its nature was decentralized. So it was very difficult to control it or to have people follow one lead. But I think one way that people centralized was almost everybody who had court cases, almost everyone who had got arrested had to centralize, because we wanted each other's help. We had to make sure that everyone else was looked after. So that was one way. And apart from that, there were a lot of different organizations that came up, and a lot of people also who were sort of making political commentary, or who were staying at the protest site, who were occupants, started having their own little social media channels. Right? A lot of people ended up doing podcasts. So it was a way of sustaining their voice or continuing to make their political commentary about the things or the changes that were happening. And another positive thing that I see is, especially with the current political context and the candidates that are running, for the first time in history, if I'm not mistaken, we have a transgender person running for the elections this time. And we also have significant number of women running for elections this time. So I think those things were made evident during the protest movement, given the amount of women who came out to take part in the protest, right? And given the prominence of the LGBTQ or sexual minorities, not being scared to voice their opinions, and how they took up space at the protest site. So I think there were certain elements that translated into the political context that we see currently as well. And in terms of what people asked for many things. One of the main demand was asking for the president to step down. But I always think that it was not directed at this one individual. It was rather directed at the center or the core of the system itself. And then the biggest demand we heard was to give our stolen money back, which is a debate that we still having, like whether it's really possible, is it really not possible? If it's not possible, why? If it's not possible, then shouldn't this whole system be changed if it allows people to? All of these questions still there. I believe mainly what people wanted or what people demanded was to be treated with dignity, to be treated as dignified human beings. I remember this one time, this set of drummers who came to the protest site, they actually said, we don't have weapons in our hands. We don't have sticks, or we have nothing against you. We are here as peaceful citizens, and we are going to play this drum and ask our leaders to treat us like humans. And we saw this slogan of right to life having quite a big prominence during the protest movement as well. But I think we still don't understand right to life as the right to dignified life yet, at least not in the context of the Constitution, at least not in the context of lawmaking. We still look at right to life as the right to live without being tortured. So that's like just to exist. But I believe that people wanted to be treated with dignity. People didn't want to be continuously be lied to, be cheated on, be, stolen from. So these these elements were just few that I could think of, especially taking the context of the questions that were asked. So I think in terms of changing up protest to a mass movement, we saw how social media played a key role. We saw how artists and creativity played a key role. And also especially this notion of having a safe space. For the first time ever, I walked in Golf Face from one corner to the other at around 2 o'clock in the night alone without even hearing a whistle, without being catcalled. And for Sri Lanka, I think it's a big deal. And, we take this thing about being catcalled as something that automatically happens, something that you have to live with. But what I experienced at the protest site was that everybody was there to show their dissent. They were not there to catcall. And there was this unspoken rule of live and let live. And I also remember seeing my friends who would usually, dress up when they go to a place had just come without really caring what they look like. Nobody really, that there was this notion that you're finally free from being judged for what you look like or what you think or what you talk. And there was this freedom for everybody to be who they are, at least during the first month of the Aragale, I'd say. And these, in terms of turning protest into mass movements, I think with all of this, there were socio-economic elements that played a big role. If it wasn't for the electricity cuts that lasted for 12 hours, I don't think most people would have ever gotten into the streets. Most of people who had used to experience comfort or that used to be within our comfort zones would never get onto the streets if our living environment didn't become uncomfortable. And in terms of changing them into mass movements, I think it was not only the will of the people, it's also in some way there's the lines of democracy that kept getting moved time to time. That also played a role, in addition to the economic conditions that created the pressure towards the people. And on the weeks leading up to 9th of July, I remember that we created videos, we created social media posts asking people to join, but none of us were really sure how many people would come. But and during this time, there were also young people who went and spoke at different bus stations, and they would go to these small areas in Colombo and would talk to people and tell them look, you have to come this day, we are calling everybody to come. So it was this collective effort. And it was this one time in the history that we all gave our best without really knowing what we were going to get back, and without also be different from the party politics that we see when, somebody, especially from a political party, when you do something, you expect something back. You expect something that you can take on afterwards. But I think the weeks leading to 9th of July, which was the biggest day of the protest, where hundreds of thousands of people came to the streets and occupied the buildings. It was this collective effort where everybody had
Hello, we can't hear anything. We can't hear anything.
Intrigue of democracy as an allowed space. This is what it actually has been. And in certain ways, it probably still is. But that space allowed might have increased, in quite a bit, I would say. I also thought of something that you said about protests, Sri Lankan protests having, very significant presence of youth. And you see that in Bangladesh, you see that in a lot of other places, including these very short-term protests in Afghanistan too, where they didn't last for very long, 2 hours, 3 hours sometimes. Women, not too long ago. Now, the point I want to make and also to ask this question for us to think about later is when a protest involves the participation of a lot of young people, does it have uh, a more pronounced possibility of success, or the other way around? Right? Because now, in the case of Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, whatever the consequences, this was not an accident. You had a lot of youth participations, and the consequences were very pronounced. Now, I'm not talking in terms of negatives or positives, just things happen. The other thing I wanted to refer to is about the nature of humor. Your kind of thing. Humor and the way the kinds of politics, electronic media, and things like memes play in protests. And a lot of things. I mean, Sri Lankan public sphere was filled with these kinds of things. And I think very creative humor, nasty too at times, right? But that, see, humor kind of thing comes up also when the kind of reasons that led to these protests was so severe that it was actually difficult to show any kind of protest before that in any other creative form. So because as I was saying at the beginning, public sphere in these kinds of places were getting reduced and very restrictive. So, but humor, particularly with memes and particularly memes, was a fairly safe place. You can be anonymous if you want to, but you can still say what you want. Now, the risk, of course, of art, that you see a lot of art in the 2022 protests. You also saw a lot of art in the Shahbag protests in Delhi, not the Bangladesh one. Delhi also had this. Remember 1 month or so against the Citizenship Amendment Act? Shahbag, yes, sorry. Now then again, there was a lot of art, but I know some of my friends who were part of it didn't want artists to take part, which is very different from 2022. When I asked these guys, why is it that you are stopping these creative people from taking part? He said, we don't want this to be a carnival, then that will end with that. So that is a risk about which we should actually ask this question. To what extent would a protest be productive with creative work, or will it become an end by itself? In certain ways, you could see that happening in 2022, even though it led to a lot of change, right? I just want to say one more thing, and then we'll go to Irene. And there is this very important thing, I think, that happened in the 2022 protest, which I think has also now happened in Bangladesh, and that is the fear that South Asian citizens had of their politicians just vanished, right? So you saw people being stopped in Battaramulla, these politicians, and people were basically like Sarath Vijay Sekar, that Navy guy, I forget I don't know whether the name was correct. And people are telling you, I mean, I can't repeat what they said, but that fear really, I mean, it vanished. And I think that fear of the people still remains, which is why a lot of these guys who were stars in that on the other side of their protests are not contesting elections now. So that is another consequence. And that even the people who are contesting are silent, relative. I don't see an election fever in this country right now. And there is relative silence. They don't want to go out and get told off. So these are all consequences. And I think that happened in Bangladesh too, but also in fairly in Bangladesh's case, I will leave it up to Irene to talk about. But let's look at some of these things in a kind of a reflective sort of way, so that the protest doesn't become an act by itself in isolation. I just want it to be contextual. This is what I'm trying to say. So Irene, if you are ready, now we can let you speak, please.
Thank you so much, sir. It's
We can't hear you, Irene. Can you see whether the volume can be increased?
okay. Can you hear me now?
Oh, wait a minute. It might be at this end. Hold it. Give me a second, please. Can you increase the volume? Give us a couple of minutes, please. Anyway, good to see you. And I assume you are joining from Dhaka.
Yes, I am joining from Dhaka.
Wonderful.
Good afternoon.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Huh?
Is it better? Is it better now?
No, it's still
No.
being fixed. So we'll see how it goes. Is it possible? I see. Irene, is it possible to go to your controls and see whether the voice input can be increased, the microphones? Put it right to the top. Have you muted yourself by any chance, Irene?
So I think we checked. I think we checked.
Fine.
my-
That is, I think you're fine.
Okay.
Okay, let's go.
Ji.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you very much.
No, it's all right. Anyway, I had to take 2 minutes because the azan was on here. So anyway, that I got that time. So first of all, good afternoon, Shubha Shondha. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I met Ma'am Priyanti Ma'am in a few days ago. And I was like really moved and touched, and it's an honor. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I thought I would give a brief about the protest and what happened here, but as the discussion goes, as Shashank sir had like opened up some questions for this platform. Maybe I will start. I resonate with Melanie where she mentioned that freedom and the sense to become free. People want to be free, and the lack of dignity. When people feel this lack of dignity, these are two very triggering points, I think, to bring people for a protest. But what is a protest? I think now when realizing we could not vote for 2 terms. So the last time we had a fair vote was in 2009. And then we had, this was the fourth time this year. And for 3 times, people could not participate in a proper electoral process. So I think when people vote, that is also a protest. Not only practicing a right, citizen right, a democratic right, but also it's a protest when we don't want someone. During the BNP reign in the early 2000s, when the country saw militancy, Islamist militancy, we rejected that government. We wanted reform. And then we had a 2-year break of interim government backed by army. And we did not want that either. And then I think the voices of people that came through the election in 2009, the Awami League gets 2/3 majority vote itself was a protest of the people, a voice of the people, what they don't want, or what they want to reject. And they gave another party a chance. It's a huge country, and we have been facing a politics of division for a very long time. Both the blocks, the nationalist bloc and the other bloc. I would not call it an Islamist bloc because there are different variety of thoughts in this bloc. So I cannot label it as one. But this particular bloc took the streets and toppled the government. And they are working as the government, not even the shadow government, as the government. How? We all know what happened on 5th August. Sheikh Hasina fled, and there was hundreds and thousands of millions of people on the street. Students called for a march to Dhaka movement and for the demand of Sheikh Hasina's resignation. We still did not know what was happening and what will happen. And there was lots of violence. Snipers sniper bullets were used against the population, against the unarmed people, not only on the protesters. I'm talking about there were tear gas shells dropping from the helicopters in civilian society communities. There were shooting from helicopters which killed children in their homes, in their rooftops. When there was a helicopter, flying very low, so people went out and wanted to see what was there with joy, and a lot of people died. So mother stood out. Mother said that I am going to take on the street for justice for other mothers who lost their children in this. So although it started as a quota movement, but this was just not one movement that brought this victory, which was a premature victory, actually, maybe. How and why, I will come back to that later. But it all started with this quota reserved seat movement, or this demand, which where Sheikh Hasina's government took a series of wrong decisions. But why this happened, and what made this happen? Like, what happened on the streets, and why in the street? Because I think for a 15-year-long authoritarian government, many people call it an authoritarian system. This was not just a party, not just a government. It was a system that was an authoritarian system that was constructed over 15 years. So, and this system and that government, they divided the population in blocks, and there was one block which was marginalized as Rajakars, and those who come with Islamist sentiments or come with madrasa backgrounds, so they are all labeled or come under that category those who are not integrated in the society in the mainstreams, or looked upon, or are not do not get proper opportunities. They felt there was discrimination in the society, so they called their movement anti-discrimination movement. This was not just one movement. This was a series of movements, series of protests, which was some very visible, some on the street, some in the newspaper, and a lot silently and through reactions, through voices and through silences. Every medium, every other medium, every alternative medium have been used over the years to express that what people want. Uh, and when people saw that that was not reflected, what is dignity? Why do people want dignity? And what will satisfy their dignity? I think it is the sense of taken care of, that I have a government who thinks about me, who doesn't marginalize me and do not give me opportunities and give up their other children better opportunities and label us differently. And it's a us versus other problem in the society that we all face in this continent, maybe. But Europe has suffered from this, I think, more and longer than we did. But they have overcame it, and we could not. Maybe it's because we need this is not cannot be done in one country in this region, because South Asia is just not one. We are the people of Indian civilization, whichever nationality we have. Shashank sir mentioned about human nature. I think this fear that this will come back, get this protest alive. Whether when a protest is led by this young generation, do they have more, as you asked, that do they have more success, like better success rate for it, for their protest? I think they represent the largest population now. They are the largest population. More than 85% people of Bangladesh are now below the age of 55. So they are a big population. And they're a different population, very different population. Wherever the states blocked all the institutions where people go and use to express their right, to express their decisions, to give their opinion, all the institutions were taken away from people. And people made their alternative mediums. People took on the streets, took on the walls. There were graffitis overnight. The walls were all colorful, asking for demands with their reactions. And it's difficult to stop people. And but the success, what is the success of a protest? It's like a river, it's a flow, it's the political course and discourses. I think we are still a part of this historical divisions of Hindu, Muslim, nationalism, religion, what comes first, what's next, what's second. But I think as a whole, as a people from South Asia, we need some kind of mass uprising where people need to come together. Maybe it's through protest, maybe it's through a cultural revolution, civilization linkage or something, but it is time that we stop this authoritarian government. And I think that is the success of this protests of this generation. Maybe it may light up suddenly and it may go low, it may get hijacked in the when it is successful. But it still has its power. It's still like when after the protest of Bangladesh, people in Nepal were talking about it. They said they appreciated the way youth showed their bravery, and there were Bangladeshi flag flying in Balochistan. In Pakistan, people were giving slogans in Bangla. it has its power. Whether if even if this protest gets hijacked, the protest, which was led by the Gen Z young population, but there were all the entities behind it. So we cannot actually give all the credit to all the student protesters, but it was achieved through them, or maybe through them. Some political parties might come now and try to hijack it and use them, but it's experience and knowledge matters in dealing politics. Knowing something theoretically and actually in the political ground in our complex societies are quite different. I think diversity is our strength and our nature, our ecology is our strength. From here, we have to think about everything and togetherness and oneness and move forward. I would answer more questions, but I will stop here now. Thank you so much.
We will go to David in a little while. Thank you, Irene, to putting a kind of contextual sensibility to this whole thing. Obviously, all of us have been following what has been going on in Bangladesh long before this recent protests, but even from 2013, when Shahbag and all these kinds of things were happening. But see, I just want to rattle off a few things and then we'll go to David, because see, I have a long-term interest in trying to work something out about how to understand protests. I was intrigued by something you said about motivation to protest. And you said that, lack of dignity was a very important condition. See, that is pretty important because oftentimes what happens is that in our kind of situation or any situation, see, we think it would be material condition that leads people to protest. Like when Melanie was saying that if not for the electricity cuts in Sri Lanka, people wouldn't have gone down to protest in large numbers, and that is perfectly a fact. But even in our case, dignity was an important thing because people were not taken seriously for a very long time. And in the case of Bangladesh, it was even worse because for 15 years you had this regime, right? And unfortunately, Sheikh Hasina was a icon for freedom at one point of time, right? But then when somebody stays in power for 15 years, this is what happens. So in that case, see, voting, this is also something you said, voting as a protest is also important, just as much as for some people, not voting is also a mark of protest, but that can be very counterproductive in certain conditions. Now, I've been trying to tell my younger colleagues and friends to go and vote for somebody, however you disagree with even though you don't have an ideal political outcome. But some of them refuse to do that. So then what happens is a vote is wasted, right? And that is a criminal thing in these kinds of situations. Now, you can't have an ideal world, so you try to at least nudge it in a particular direction. So this is what not voting is, to me, not always the best thing. I am intrigued by this quota movement. I mean, of course, all of us know this is what led to the current protest, but also in the case of Bangladesh, things have been going on in all sorts of ways since 2022. And then the quota movement really captured the attention of all these groups that were going on. So and to me, the problem is when I'm looking at the Bangladesh protests today in the public domain, it is reduced to the quota movement. And I think it's much bigger than that. Right? But it's not reduced to that in Bangladesh. I'm talking about the way it's reported outside the country, right? And the last thing is about how a protest might be hijacked. In our case, it certainly was to some extent. In your case, I'm pretty sure it will be. But then you just have to, I mean, not you, meaning not just you, but people like you, I think needs to be, you're already mindful of that. So that is necessary because there will always be hijackers, right? But thank you, Irene. We'll come back to you in a little while after listening to David. Is David up there somewhere? David, I don't see you, but let me see if we can find you. Um,
Hello, can you hear me?
we can hear you, but we can't see you. Do you want to switch on your video or you do not want for whatever reason?
I will switch on my video.
Okay, thank you very much, David. All right, man.
Thank you
Good
so
to see
much.
you. Please go ahead.
Sorry, I will go ahead. Thank you so much. It's quite an interesting debate coming up at a time when the was and of course many protests are taking place almost everywhere. And looking at your first of all, I want to say that Kenya has had a long history of protests. And if you look at when the country was fighting for multipartyism, protests actually are the ones that led to repealing of the Section 2A of the Kenyan Constitution. By then, that was
David, just let me stop you for a moment. There is a problem of reception. Can you try knocking off your video and just use audio? Thank you. Let's continue, please.
good. Can you hear me now?
Yes, beautiful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Wonderful. So I was just saying that Kenya has had a long history of protests. And of course, people talk about Gen Zs, the recent protests, but you can trace them back to the late 80s and early 90s when Kenyans were fighting for democratic space. The reason why I'm saying this is because such protests have actually informed the current protests that we have in Kenya. And these protests are in most cases triggered by the urge of fighting for against oppression, because they find that well-known successful protests took place in 90s, 91, which led the then regime to accept multipartyism. So you find that the NGO influence in or what we call in Kenya, the NGOization of actions and protests actually started by then, because you find that in most cases, the protests that were being taking place in the 90s were largely and from behind the scenes being supported by non-governmental, by actually foreign organizations. And of course, in the 90s, we had a US ambassador who came to be called a rogue ambassador. And he was called a rogue ambassador by the then regime because he was vocally pro-protests and was actually speaking against breaking down of protests. And this one has led to the history that we have today about protests, where the government has always looked at protests, whether organic or not, as being instigated or supported by foreign forces. And this is a propaganda that has been successfully used by the government to be able to break protests or actually make sure that they don't succeed. So if you look at the Gen Z protests, that actually, I think it is the climax of the Kenyan protests. They were largely triggered by, of course, issues of finance bill, issues of IMF and World Bank were actually at the core of these. But I think it was a culmination of a long-term inequality that has been in place in the country. The country is facing the worst inflation. The country is in a debt crisis. Right currently, the universities, only a few of them are functioning, and you know that most of the university students actually form the biggest population of the Gen Zs, that's as we call them. Of course, we have youths in the slums and in the rural areas, some of them educated, informed, of course, connected through the internet. They are able to get information of what's happening in the country. So all the combination of all these things actually led to what is now popularly known as the Gen Z's protests. So just a year before the Gen Z protest, we also had another protest called by the opposition. And the opposition was also protesting against the Finance Bill 2023. So, and the protest against the Finance Bill 2023 actually led to a lot of deaths, and it led to the formation of a national dialogue committee, which brought together opposition figures and government figures to try and work out formulas of looking at what was happening. So that pressure from, because the pressure from the 2023 actually spilled over 2024, whereby in 2024, because the opposition was already talking to government, but the issues were still the same. So this led to the young people coming out and picking up that message and saying that, yes, we're having another finance bill. And this finance bill is about taxation. It's about how we are going to live. People are already complaining about high fuel prices, high cost of living. And the Gen Z protests are like the past protests, like even the 2023 protests by the opposition were only in the opposition zones. But if you look at the Gen Z protests, they were across the country. There are small towns and small market centers that had never recorded protests, since independence. And the June 25th, which is actually seen as the climax of the Gen Z protests, actually saw protests, I think it was almost between 75 to 80% of across the country, from the government strongholds to opposition strongholds. Everybody was speaking about the issues, and nobody was talking about politics. People were talking about the members of parliament should not pass the finance bill. And the rage that led to the burning of the parliament was actually as a result of people expressing their frustrations that the members of parliament did not hear the plea of the people. And that's what led to the breaking of parliament. So the trigger here, to me, is not actually the issue of, for example, fighting for political power, as now the government want to do it, but it was triggered by the livelihood, the quality of life that people are living. People can barely afford 3 meals in a day. People are living in debts, microcredits. Everybody's on debts. You borrow to pay rent, you borrow to buy food, you borrow to pay food. So the message that was being passed across resonated with the majority of the Kenyans who are suffering. So although the procession was led by the Gen Zs, but it was supported across board, the old, the middle class who are almost disappearing because they have a lot of debts to repay. There's a lot of dependency ratio. So everybody was pulling from their side, looking at their tribulations. And if you look at the contribution of that in terms of course, reclaiming sovereignty, I must say that although from the face value, people might want to say that the protests did not yield anything, but it led to the dissolution of cabinet. And even today, it also led, the spillovers have also led to impeachment of the deputy president, because when people are saying we don't want the government, the ruling class have already regrouped, and of course they are trying to pass blame games, accusing the deputy president of being the one who was supporting the protests, and then you find now that in an attempt to politicize, the protests that were very much popular and that did not have any popular support. So I can say that today, if you go to every corner of the country, they'll tell you we have the power. They'll tell you we are still regrouping. They'll tell you we are going to come back. So that is the message that is passing across. Even up to date in Kenya, there are still pockets of protests taking place in other forms. For example, if you go to X Spaces every evening, you'll find over 50 to 100 different X Spaces across the country discussing several issues, planning and organizing. Of course, the state, since June 25, has become more repressive. Just recently, when people were trying to gather to honor the over 60 youths who died, the state actually responded very violently, arresting people who are organizing. And of course, the state has also responded by abductions, where they are colluding with the telecommunication companies. And that also tells you some of them are foreign companies. So that tells you how corporations are aiding the state in stifling the voice of the people. And of course, if you look at that, I think democracy in Kenya has taken a new trajectory, because Kenya don't have strong social movements, if like in South America and other areas. Kenya kind of has cut its teeth around NGOs and the civil society that works on logical framework. So the Gen Z's protest was kind of the first one that was kind of organic. It was being organized online. It did not have any support of big NGOs, big political parties. And this kind of scared the main players, because we have the NGOs that have been known to calling protests. We have the parties that have been known to be calling protests. So this led both the government, the ruling elite within the government, within the opposition, within the NGOs to regroup. And as the protest, whereby several people could emerge and declare themselves the leaders of the protests, and of course, several of them going to meet in State House with the government, and this kind of these machinations, including using armed thugs, using police to loot, and to just to make the protesters lose face among the Kenyan public. This is not a new strategy. During the pre-colonial period, during the Mau Mau period, because most of the Mau Mau freedom fighters were dreadlocked. So we had the colonial government paying people to have locks, and then they could come to the villages, slaughter people, so that they could actually spread some propaganda and smear campaign against the freedom fighters. The same has been replicated since then, with different groups emerging. They are calling protests. They are saying they are going to beat up people. People should not come out, and because the government was portraying the protests as something not genuine, as something we have heard even the government saying it was supported by Ford Foundation, it was supported by the impeached deputy president, it was supported by CSOs, and people are not patriotic. Yeah, so what I would say in short is that just like in Sri Lanka and in Bangladesh, most of these protests actually, especially the organic ones, like the one for Gen Zs, organized by people who don't have strong grassroots bases. Because in Kenya, the strong institutions are political parties and religious institutions. So you find that organizing outside those strong institutions is very difficult. Because, for example, there's no way you can be able to know who is a genuine protester or not. And of course, issues of what happens after the protests is very interesting, because we were hearing the history of Bangladesh, where the premier left, and the person who took over is somebody who has been there before. So those issues have actually also been troubling people in Kenya. And at some point, when people were saying Ruto must go, the government must go, people were asking who will take over. Is it the military? Is it the position that is compromised? And who they organized to where the negotiations were taking place. So that kind of also made the people to kind of backtrack. The case of Sudan, just closer to us, is still alive to us in our minds, where protesters took to the streets. They removed General Bashir. But what's happening in Sudan now? Some of the protesters, the leaders have been killed, they have been exiled, and you find that whatever we're having there is actually even worse than what used to be there. So one issue that I might be able to comment before I finish is that maybe just to respond to the question of what happens when there's no clear agenda. Because when the agenda is to remove a person, when the person leaves, then the protest movement breaks, because everybody, it heralds a new era of power struggles. Who is the leader, and what happens next? So I think, of course, they say revolutions are never televised, but I think there must be some level of organizations in terms of fulfilled or failed needs. I think for the first time in the history of this republic, the president had to refuse to sign a finance bill, not because he loved it, not because he was happy. It's because he was forced by the people's power. And the fact that the president had to go to the opposition, which he used to abuse, which they contested very bitter elections, to go to the opposition for rescue, it shows you that the people's power is very strong. Because what is happening in Kenya is that the ruling class has come together to defeat the power of the people. So the protest movement, what I would say in Kenya right now, is that there's still tension. There might not be people on the streets, but if you look at the government, the way it's operating, the state machineries, they are operating in fear. The policemen are everywhere, patrolling, getting into every space, getting into every meeting, wanting to know whatever is happening. And even you find that even the religious leaders are now being told that before you give your summons, you need to send copies to the government to see what they're going to. So that in itself is a reaction of the people's power and how people power when organized. So I can say that it is not a lost cause in Kenya. There's still need for more mobilization and more organization in terms of ensuring that the issues or the interests of the people are actually put at the forefront. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. You have added to my education. Kenya is not some place I know that much about. But some of the things that you talked about, your own context, also, I would say, resonate in this part of the world. For example, when you referred to that in some protests that NGOs are supporting protests, and the word you used was NGOization, and some of these are not organic. And this is also one of the criticisms that Sri Lankan government at that time, and even the Bangladesh government, the Sheikh Hasina government, also claimed when protests were ongoing that they said two things: NGOs funding them, foreign powers. Right now, this foreign power business was very clearly articulated in Bangladesh. In our case, it was mostly supposed to be NGOs. So I'm not saying that NGOs don't play a role in these things. I'm not that naive, right? But then I also supported that protest from my salary. Once I gave some unknown people 5 butt packets, and then another time I gave 20. So that it is, I'm not an NGO, right? So, but then NGOs might have given more. So what? I mean, I'm talking about, but there is a difference if a people's protest is somehow hijacked by these organizations. That is a separate. So that I think that is what David was trying to say, that there is all that, there is that element of risk, right? But I, at the same time, I want to make it clear. I mean, we already know this, and that is, a protest is not some kind of a puritanical site. It has all kinds of things going on in it. There are politicians who are trying to make, the most of it. There are those of us And then there are, NGOs and so on and so forth. So it is a kind of a multiple, I would say, site that is confusing at multiple levels. So that is the nature of protest. I didn't really understand. I didn't hear because of the disturbances what David was saying about social movements in Kenya. I just didn't hear it. But I have a suggestion for BCI. This is something you should do at some point, and that is to invite people, if not here, at least this way, to talk about social movements. There's a lot of interesting material that has been generated in Sri Lanka. I mean, not so much in Sri Lanka, but here too. Lots of material in India and in Bangladesh and in Nepal. And I think we should be reading or at least conversing about some of these things so that we can also situate what happened with us in that context, which we still haven't done. And if you need any help, please let me know. Another thing that there are two other things that David said, which also make sense to us, and that is the how the rhetoric of a protest sometimes potentially diminishes its outcome, because rhetoric is very powerful. It says this person must go. And that becomes the overarching approach. And then when the person goes, as happened with Mr. Rajapaksa, then there is, I mean, what he said was, when the person goes, the protest breaks. In our case, it didn't really break, but it did ran into all sorts of confusions. So what he was trying to say, and I think I fully agree, is that any protest, if it's likely to be successful, also have to have some kind of a plan. Now, this is easier said than done, because protests don't happen with a plan most of the time, right? Okay, so I don't want to prolong my comments on David's presentation. It's also becoming quite late. So if there are any conversations you want to engage with Melanie, Irene, or David, please, now's the time. Yes, Irene, please go ahead.
David was mentioning, thank you, David, for sharing this information. I did not know much about what is happening in Kenya, so it was a good refreshing update. So you mentioned that the lack of quality, not having the quality of life was one of the problems what triggered mass movements. What happened in the case of Bangladesh, we were going through economic development, and if you go to the villages of Bangladesh, you would not see any home without a television, quite a big television, or a refrigerator. All the villages are model villages, model towns mostly now. So there was an uplifting with the economic development. There was an uplifting in the society, economic society, during this Hasina's authoritarian reign. Even when there were many policies taking place in her earlier era, a lot of the people from civil society were saying maybe it takes a Mahathir to make Malaysia. So people were seeking for some level of authoritarian or some level of dictatorship in leading the nation. But again, this kind of dual characteristic of the nation we have, like then we want to decide what should be the portion, what should be the recipe of that force, of that control, and that's where the balance comes, like how much to lose up and how much to control. I think people don't mind a certain level of control. Maybe people don't understand how to act free, because freedom takes a lot of responsibility. But people wanted freedom. People wanted to feel treated equally. People wanted equal opportunities, and that's where this dignity comes. Like people wanted dignity. Now they have a economic better life. Now they want dignity. But I think dignity is more important to people than their economic well-being sometimes. Because or maybe that's how I I'm having changing views about what I'm seeing in this region, in Bangladesh, and we're witnessing history. And earlier about the Gen Z population and protests through them. But I think it's a global language. Democracy, I think democracy is universal. Now there is no question of non-democracy. Um, it's how people want to be governed and how economic policies needs to be defined, or what should be the what benefits people get as a nation. Even under authoritarian regime, maybe even under maybe socialist economic setups. Um, I think democracy is not a question anymore. It's very universal. I think it's how it should be. Governance is the issue, and people practicing their power as citizens is also a thing that I think should come from people. Um, um, that's what I wanted to add in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. Wian, you have anything to say to that last thing? Because you have been talking about democracy and a particular South Asian kind of democracy for a very long time.
Yeah,
Michael-
I mentioned that democracy is is a universal thought.
Yes, we
I
got it.
think what people want now is the way of governance. And now, like a lot of people talking about changing the constitution of Bangladesh. Why? Because these student protesters are demanding that the system itself gives permission to authoritarian regimes to come. And the constitution should be very light and very simple and small, not complicated, and it should represent people. And then, yeah, uh, and then people are trying to define our discourses around nationalism. What should be being Bangladeshi or Bengali Muslim or what? So, but these should come under the state system, not as political system. So that's what
Absolutely.
people are talking about right now.
Giappone con le grandi cinzia. Oppure con un chiedo. Non so poi,
To what I said, it's okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Sasanka, for inviting me to respond to, I think, the last question. Kenya, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, even in India, have two levels of resistance. Can you hear me? Please? No, I was just saying that in Sri Lanka, Kenya, and even in India, there are two levels of political resistance. In all these societies, the people have rejected existing authoritarian too, and the demand for imagining the democracy. You see, you could see that Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, various, and Bangladesh, a lot of people are using this term, this authoritarian, autocratic system, autocratization. And Sri Lanka was on the way towards a kind of autocratization. In Kenya and India too, you have that autocratization tendency. So in that context, the existing forms of democratic governance, democratic structures and processes actually cannot cope with the threats of this autocratization, authoritarian regimes. They want the democracy into their hands. That is why the theme of this, the democracy on the streets. For the electoral process, usual parliamentary process cannot or have not been able to stem these tendencies toward authoritarianization and not authoritarianization. So people take democracy into their hands. This is also a critique of the conventional liberal democracy has a notion of citizenship, and citizens are turned into voters, and the citizens, this passive citizenship actually, that's one of the fundamental, actually, core shortcomings of liberal parliamentary democracy. In our societies, liberal parliamentary democracy has been in crisis for decades, but it has not been recognized. It has not been acknowledged. Actually, it has been acknowledged by various groups of armed resistance. Sri Lanka's first protest was not what you were talking about, university students' protest for 2020 to Aragalaya, but there were actually how many decades? In the 70s, 80s, 90s, 4 decades of armed resistance, armed protests. But have they been democracy enhancing protests? No. But what is very specific about, say, Sri Lanka's protests in 2022, it can be characterized as a democracy enhancing popular protest in a context where the Sri Lankan democracy has been in a deep crisis. Not only democracy as a whole, but also particularly representative democracy. And if you look at the slogans that came out through the Aragale, actually these are demands for fundamental reassessment of the way representative parliamentary democracy has worked in Sri Lanka, has been actually transformed into Sri Lanka. So that's why this very powerful slogan of system change. In Bangladesh, I think there's a very serious, issue that Irene can respond to my comment. Because in Sri Lanka, at least there is a delayed agency coming in to, the transform, at least make an attempt to transform the politics. That's what we saw the last presidential election. In Bangladesh, I don't see such an agency, right? And it's a situation now is actually very, very precarious, the future of democracy. Sri Lanka, at least there is some form of hope we can have, some, degree of pre-democratization of politics. But Bangladesh, we don't see that agency at the moment.
Thank you very much. So, yes, I'll go back. Yeah. So the question, but make some comments if we want. Why the establishment led by Mr. National Security suppressed our now, hello, can you hear me now? Oh, sorry. Sorry, can you hear me now? Hello, can you hear me? Okay. So, question is, why didn't Mr. National Security himself, was the president, suppress the Aragalaya movement? Now, give some background. We've been a rebellious nation, and in the past, as he mentioned, we've had 3 civil wars, JUP 1, JUP 2, and the Tamil nationalists. And they were suppressed, and even foreign countries aided the effort. In the case of the Tamil nationalist movement, the militancy, there was a geopolitical element. So we had a tough time overcoming that. So that was my question. What happened there? I mean, I'm hinting that there is always geopolitics involved, and those factors are coming in. See, I'm no expert. Now, this is something you might have something to say, but I know there were. It's working. Anyway, I'm loud enough, no? So, see, I know. See, uh, this question has been floating around since that time, and there have been all kinds of insinuations or suggestions in social media and so on why this happened. But I don't know why. So his question is very reasonable question, and that is, why did the president not immediately suppress the Aragale when he technically could have, right? So I don't have an answer. I know he didn't. Exactly. That is precisely there is that gossip, and there is also other gossip which I don't want to say here. But that is the main thing, and most probably that was correct, right? So there was somebody else. No, yes, Susuri.
I just want to pose this question that keeps coming up in the history of regime change in the world. So many countries have faced regime change from the 50s onwards, and there has been one agency that was responsible, and I don't mind giving the name, that is the United States. They have been systematically changing regimes from the 1950s onwards when they felt the regimes were not suitable for their larger geopolitical interests. This has been happening from Mossadegh in Iran and so on, right? Chile and whole of the Latin America and so on. Now, in that context, I'm just asking the question, why still this question is not being debated adequately? Sheikh Hasina openly has said that the US wanted the St. Martin's Island and she refused, and therefore she was deposed. Gota in his book doesn't name names, but definitely says about an international conspiracy. And then we have a whole series in the world where regimes have been changed because of US interests. And we are now almost having a kind of elephant in the room, and we are ignoring it, and we are just talking of other very interesting, subtle things which are really not fundamental. I think we should ask the question, books are going to be written in the future, and many books have already been written about it. And then only we will really understand what happened to Sri Lanka in 2022.
Thank you. No, you have a point. You have a point, and I'm no, I'm, I'm no friend of the United States, even though I studied there. But see, Susirit, for me, if I'm going to write about it, I'm a old-fashioned academic, right? So you're right. Now, Gota has said this. I read that book, and Sheikh Hasina, soon after she ran off to India, said the same thing. And it is entirely possible that that this might be true, but we know for a fact that from Chile onwards, or even before, from Bay of Pigs and all these kind of things, this has been happening for a very long time. But if it's up to me to write about it in the local context, obviously I need facts. So that is the only thing that if there's a reluctance in my some people like me, not me to discuss it at the moment, is not because it is unlikely, because we need something tangible, right? Yes. Now we come to Sanji.
Yeah. So I have, I'm only observing the Aragalayer from social media for the last 2 years. Let's say last 3 years, I started noticing at the beginning of 2022. And I also lived the terror years of 87, 88, 89, and so on. And I remember in that time, I think Sri Lanka was in a much worse state, especially late 80s, where in the north and in the south, there was bloodbath. There was IPKF in the north, and in the south, there were students being killed, and also members of the state were being murdered. So, but at that time, we didn't have social media. So what I noticed in 2022 is that we were more conscious of what happened because of social media. And there were many Facebook lives, and I think quite a lot of percentage of Sri Lankan citizens are on social media, especially on Facebook. So I think we cannot undermine the effect the social media discussion had on getting the citizens involved. And that may be one of the reasons that everyone feels a part of it, because you feel like you know what's happening. To just give one clear example, I remember I was watching the Facebook lives of what happened in Mirihana on the 31st of March 2022. And then there was that was for those who are not aware, what happened was 31st of March, there was some protest in front of Gota's house. And then the next day, the media were suddenly reporting that there had been a bus burned down by the protesters, and then around 40 protesters were arrested. But then a Facebook Live went viral because somebody had seen a police officer with an assistant putting kerosene and burning a bus. And then everybody was like thinking, oh my God, this is something we are not being told what really happened. So people started taking the side of the protesters. And then I remember one lawyer had gone to the police station and put on social media, I'm here alone. There are these 40 protesters. Can we have pro bono lawyers? And by the end of the evening, around 800 lawyers from the Bar Association have turned up. So I think we should also give some credit to the social media, the effect of social media.
I think that credit has been given. I don't know whether it's come to academia, but it has been given, and not just here, but globally, starting from even the uprising in Egypt, and also in Iran before that, you know. Please, sorry.
My points, what I'm going to present now, relates to what Professor Susirit Mendis presented right now. The point he raises very important point. But after all the revolutions and uprisings, the same the allegation came forward. For example, after Russian Revolution, Bolshevik Revolution, Shah said the February Revolution and October Revolution. Then Shah, as well as the provisional government, said Bolshevik Revolution is the German conspiracy. German conspiracy brought forward the Russian Revolution. That is the case even in the American Revolution also. As a history student, the American Revolution, the third stated very clearly that is the French were behind American Revolution. Yes, maybe Lenin had some secret dealings with the German German authority as well as, but can we explain the Russian Revolution simply explaining that is the French conspiracy and American Revolution, French conspiracy? I think we have to have a much more social scientific approach in order to understand uprisings, instead of explaining everything to external sources. Other thing, another point, I think when we compare these three uprisings, Sri Lankan one, Bangladesh one, Kenyan one, and also Indian, we have to locate them in historical trajectory of uprisings. For example, Sri Lankan one did not come from the sky. Even before that, various sequences of uprisings. Ratu Paswala, even before that, uh, free trade zone, the firings and fishermen and all these things, and even Japan government. There were protests stand up the certain street the protests against Japan government. That's a historical trajectory. We have to bring this historical trajectory also into focus in order to properly understand the socio-political factors of Aragalaya. Then one very presented very important 2 points. One is crisis in democracy, the existing democracy, and another point is the people. Yeah, they wanted to have a renewal of democracy, reimagine of democracy. In addition to that, but while approving accepting all these things, in addition to that, we have to take another factor, that is political economic bag collapse. That also brought into these 2 factors into the focus. Thank you.
See, I think what Susirit was trying to say is not to reduce the protest to those conspiracies, but also kind of what you're saying, but factor those things also, because right now there is a silence on it. And I think that is fair enough. Now, see, there are a lot of comments on the online chat, whatever it's called. I'm not sure whether we can go into that, but I want to give the mic to Melanie because she has something to add, and we'll see how we can do. If I can read some of those things, I will do in a little bit.
I just want to add something to that comment about like US interventions, right? Because this is something that we as the activists, so like, whoever remains from the protest movement also discussed and tried to understand. So one of the things were this meeting that US ambassador had with a couple of protesters. So my friends were there. We knew that they were going for that. And it was not this suddenly secretly called thing, they knew that they were going to go there. And it was also very, from what I know, it was a very straightforward discussion where the people who went there laid it out to them that this is a internal issue. And also the fact, I don't think anything else came out from that, instead of the ambassador giving them their card and asking them to call if any, if there's an emergency beyond that. But if you look back at some of the things that happened before the protest movement started, I think one thing that had a major impact was some of these mobile journalism workshops or knowledge that was given to, especially to the youth in Colombo, through some of the USAID programs. Right? So those things, that's actually a good thing, because if not, we still think Mirihana incident was some, what Vasanta was that? Arabi Vasanta. But because people knew how to use their mobiles to go live and to share the truth, we understood that, the government has been lying to us, not now, but even from before. And the other thing that I want to sort of touch on is this reimagined democracy, right? And when we talk about democracy, we only think it's the freedom to vote or freedom to speak or freedom of assembly, all of that. But it also has this preconceived notion of economic freedom also lead to like fundamental freedoms, or, free the market, free the people. But I think what we understood over the last few years was that is not true. I don't think even like somebody who really believes in neoliberal economics would outright say now that trickle-down economy works. So in terms of when we reimagine democracy, I think it's also very important to sort of understand this notion that economic freedom and fundamental freedoms, that they're not always the same thing.
Thank you, Melanie. See, there is one. There are quite a few on this chat box. I'm going to take just one, and I would like you to try and respond to this because your name also on it. So is mine. May so I'm going to read this now. With that, we'll close because I think people are tired and it's getting late. This is the question that I will read, and this is the only thing for which we have time. As a Sri Lankan who participated in the Aragalaya and now studying in Australia, I also want to emphasize that it's not just funding organizations that co-opt protests, but also academics outside South Asia who have never set foot in these countries. Can either the speakers or Professor Sasanka or Professor Uyan share your thoughts about ethics of co-opting by Western academia? Come. One fall on I really don't know. I can't respond to that question. Maybe you can. Okay. Okay, I'm going to then, okay, let's go to the other question because for Irene, this is a question from Nilanjana Premaratna to Irene, and I'm sorry, the first one, Uyan couldn't figure out what it means. I'm also not completely sure. So this is the question, Irene, if you are still there, this is a question to you. Would you be so kind as to share a bit about the extent to which the protests expanded to or involved in Chittagong? So this is particularly about what happened in Chittagong. Are you still there?
Yes, I am. I had two other questions, if I can just touch upon, about the agencies, democratic agencies. So the interim government, now the interim government who is in power, we did not shift to a political process yet. It's a very new thing. It has never happened. This situation has never happened in Bangladesh before. What Dr. Yunus mentioned when he took oath, he said that what we had before, we would not have again. And we as a state, everyone, including everyone, will move on from here. And we will not, we will reconciliate, and we would not do the politics of revenge. And then it was mentioned that there were 6 committees, reform committees. They are supposed to give us a report, show the citizen a report for 3 months. So all the student people and those who took the students who were at the forefront of this protest, they requested, as it is told to us, that they requested Professor Dr. Muhammad Yunus to take the lead and lead the nation through reform. And he reassured that we will go back to political democratic process, and none of the advisors want to stay in power for long because they have other things to do, and they are not politicians, and they don't want this statesmanship any longer. It's very hard and suffocating for them. So they have been reassuring this for every day almost, but the way to get out from this system and build a new one, the symbols are not much visible yet. We did not see any report yet. But the best thing is people still have the agencies to voice up and to say that, okay, we don't agree with this government that we did not have for a long time. So people practicing it, and Dr. Yunus's government is continuously saying, like, criticize us, tell us what you need. And there are committees, and we can connect to the advisors and send our requests. So these things are taking place. So we are giving this process, this new thing, some time, and we want to see what happens. We are hoping for a better change, but who knows? And about the geopolitics, we are not away from what happens geographically here. And what Sheikh Hasina said about America, there was an incident, there was a declaration that said that there would be tourists would be barred to visit St. Martin's Island. And then immediately people started reacting that, well, what Sheikh Hasina said, was it true? Is America is making a deep sea port or taking that island? So people are reacting, but there are platforms now where people can react and express their concerns. This was a policy taken in February when during the Hasina's regime that for maintenance and cleanliness, because that island is in danger. That's an atoll. These are the things. And what happened in Chittagong is actually I'm not sure what details you would like to know, but what happened in Dhaka was replicated everywhere, and every region participated in the protest in their own way. There were conveners, 26 student conveners throughout the country, and they worked in a very disciplined order. And all of them was united in one language. They did not have one leader. There is no one leader of this protest, but Dr. Mohammed Yunus introduced one guy as the mastermind of the protest in his UN speech in New York. Then we came to know that there is this was maybe what happened. We also did not know about it as like this was not disclosed that way. So then, but we have platforms now to talk about it. So people questioned to him and asked him, how did you become a mastermind when you at first claimed that it was a people's movement and there is no one mind or one leader? So these are work in progress. I would not take more time. We are at the end of the program. So, but I would like to continue this discussion in any places. And thank you so much for having time to listen to us. And thank you. It's a pleasure being here.
Thank you, Irene. Thank you very much. We have one more question from David, and then we'll close. Please, David, go ahead, please.
Yes, actually, thank you. I hope you can hear me. Yes, mine is not actually a question, but just a brief comment as we close. Maybe one, or just speaking to the issue that was spoken, I think, by Irene earlier, about when I commented about the people talking about the conditions of living. And she actually said that, I don't know, is it Sri Lanka where the protest was a result of economic development. And of course, you see, you can't have economic development and still demand for dignity. Because if economic development cannot bring dignity, then it is not development. And that's why you find that somebody might have a refrigerator, might have a television set, but does that constitute dignified life? So, well, the term development is also problematic and has to be redefined, because some development are exclusive. They impact on climate, they displace people, and that in itself leads to protests. And of course, I agree with the person who talked about the US involvement. Historically, we know that even in Kenya, rigging of elections, you find that there are even some quarters that are saying that there could have been perhaps use of the protests that were taking place in the Republic to negotiate or to twist the government that is there. And of course, if you look at even in Bangladesh, you look at Yunus, who is now the interim leader. This is a darling of IMF. This is the guy who brought microcredit, microfinance. These are the issues that are actually killing people in Africa. Women committing suicide, aiding IMF to transfer wealth from the poor. So to me, it's not a coincidence that Yunus is there. He's there and simply to propagate, just like in Kenya, where it is said that in Kenya the US had to call the president and tell him to go and sit with the opposition to form a government within 12 hours, or else they're going to support the Gen Zs. So yes, it is true that, of course, the issue, the parallels of the French influence in the American Revolution, the German influence, the Russian Revolution. There has been historically even the academia, people who are trained, IMF trained economists coming back to Africa to propagate the same system being supported. So it is quite difficult to, or there's a thin line to be able to establish whether the protests could be organic as they start. They could be organic as they start. But after they start, you find that there's a systematic attempt, because even the US is worried if it's left organically, then they're not sure of how their interests are going to be taken care of. So I agree that at some point the protest can start organically, but then the global powers, the global corporations, the business interests are always worried about their status quo and how the coming regime will perpetuate their businesses. And that's, I think, how they come in. And I also
Okay,
want to thank
David,
you so much for this. Thank you so
I'm
much.
sorry to stop you, but we have some time issues coming up. Thank you. No, we get the argument you are making. Thank you very much. But we have to close now because of organizational issues. And for the person who wrote about the Sri Lankan student who's studying in Australia, please feel free to write to me. I will be willing to engage with you on that. I just figured out what you were asking. So we'll do that by email. I want to thank the three participants who have given their time, and also to you hardcore people for staying here for this long. So maybe about this social movement thing, think about it. Then maybe it's something that can be organized in times to come. So thank you, everybody. And hopefully, Priyanti says that every Friday each month, something like this happens. So, right? No? Every Friday in November. Okay, okay. Every Friday in November or the last Friday? You want to make it very clear, please. I'm not part of BCI, so I'm a bit confused.
Thank you very much, Sasanka. Your knowledge of the timetable is much below par than your facilitation. So thank you very much for facilitating. And thank you to all the participants, David uh, and Irene for coming online, and to you, of course, not only just for being a participant, but also being a sort of surrogate internet connector. So I think she needs a big clap. So thank you. The programs are every Friday of November. I think you've all got it, right? And it's, yeah, that's it. And if you want to know what the program is, you can check where the fireworks. You can check. There's a QR code floating around which you can scan, or you have it on your it's on BCI's social media. So thank you very much. It's been a long day, and we'll see you next Friday.